In the winter of 1953, a storm that the meteorologists of the time were unable to predict with sufficient advance struck the southern North Sea during the early hours of February 1st. It was not an exceptional storm in terms of frequency. The North Sea generates this type of system every few years. What made it catastrophic was its coincidence with a spring tide of maximum coefficient and with sustained northern winds that pushed the water toward the natural trap formed by the coast of the Netherlands and the Thames estuary. The sea level rose 5.5 meters above normal. The dikes failed at more than 100 points. Almost 2,000 people died in a single night, most of them drowned in their own homes while they slept. The North Sea is not the largest ocean in the world, nor the deepest, nor the farthest from civilization. It is, in fact, quite the opposite. A small sea bordered by some of the most densely populated and technologically advanced nations on the planet, crossed every day by thousands of merchant ships, monitored by satellites and meteorological platforms, studied by generations of oceanographers. And yet it kills. With a regularity that no other maritime region in the Northern Hemisphere equals in relation to its size. The North Sea destroys ships, drowns sailors, floods cities, and generates phenomena that science has taken decades to explain and that engineering has still not fully managed to neutralize. Beneath its waters lies a lost continent, the territory of an entire civilization that the sea swallowed in a matter of centuries, leaving only flint tools and mammoth bones as proof of its existence. On its seabed sleep the remains of 30,000 shipwrecked vessels and the unexploded bombs of 2 world wars. Its storms generated the most enduring myths of Northern Europe and shaped the theology of entire peoples. Its energy resources financed national economies, and its industrial accidents rewrote the safety regulations of an entire global industry. This is the North Sea, a sea that seems known and behaves as unknown, a sea that geography turns into a trap, that physics turns into an amplifier of oceanic energy, and that history has turned into one of the most meaningful stages in the world. A sea whose waters have transported Viking armies and warships, fishing boats and oil platforms, refugees and goods, and whose bottom preserves, in silence and without witnesses, the remains of everything the sea decided to keep. Approximately 12,000 years ago, the last great glacial period came to an end. The ice sheet that covered northern Europe began to retreat, leaving behind a devastated landscape, a plain slowly flooded by the sea that today is known as the North Sea. What is currently a body of water of just over 600,000 square kilometers was, for millennia, solid land. Beneath its seabed still rest the remains of a lost continent that geologists have called Doggerland, an extensive territory that connected the British Isles with the European continent and that hosted human populations for thousands of years. Doggerland did not disappear instantaneously. Its submergence was gradual, driven by the melting of the glaciers and the consequent rise in sea level. But about 8,200 years ago, a catastrophic event accelerated its disappearance. The collapse of an immense submarine slope off the coast of Norway, known as the Storegga Slide, generated a tsunami of epic proportions that flooded the last emerged lands of Doggerland in a matter of hours. The Mesolithic populations that still inhabited those lowlands had no possibility of escape. Their descendants, those who survived in the surrounding highlands, watched as the sea swallowed forever the territory of their ancestors. Dogger Bank, that area of shallow waters that today is one of the most productive fishing grounds in the North Sea, and that gives its name to the ancient lost continent, is the last vestige of that submerged world. The trawlers that fish in its waters bring to the surface from time to time bones of mammoths, of woolly rhinoceroses, of giant deer, also flint tools worked by human hands. The floor of the North Sea is literally an archaeological archive of a civilization erased by the waters. The geography of the North Sea is peculiar among the seas of the world, bounded by the coasts of Great Britain to the west, those of Norway and Denmark to the north and east, and those of Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium and France to the south. It is an almost enclosed sea, a kind of basin opened only slightly to the Atlantic in the north and to the English Channel in the south. This semi-closure has decisive consequences for its behaviour. The ocean currents that enter from the Atlantic bring energy and heat, but they also encounter in the narrowness of the southern channel a bottleneck that multiplies their force. The storms that travel from the western Atlantic reach the North Sea with all their energy intact and concentrate over its limited waters, generating waves disproportionate to the dimensions of the sea. The average depth of the North Sea barely exceeds 90 meters, which makes it a shallow sea by oceanic standards. This characteristic, which might seem a moderating factor, is actually one of the elements that increase its danger. In a deep sea, the long and powerful waves of the Atlantic can propagate without great disturbances. In the shallow waters of the North Sea, those same waves compress vertically, shorten and steepen. The result is the so-called short and steep waves, characteristic of the North Sea, which sailors describe as especially dangerous, not because of their height, but because of their verticality and the speed with which they follow one another. The temperature of the water adds another factor of hostility. The North Sea never freezes completely, except in some exceptional years in its more eastern and shallower parts, but its winter temperatures range between 2 and 6 degrees Celsius. For a human being in the water, those temperatures mean incapacitation in a matter of minutes and death by hypothermia in less than an hour. Sailors who fall into the sea in winter do not have time for rescue, they have time for agony. This physiological reality has conditioned the entire history of navigation in the North Sea, from the methods of construction of Viking ships designed to minimize the risk of capsizing, to the modern safety protocols of the offshore industry. The Romans were the first to document the North Sea with a certain systematic rigor. Julius Caesar crossed it in the year 55 before Christ during his first expedition to Britain, and described the difficulties of the crossing with sufficient detail for modern historians to reconstruct the meteorological conditions he encountered. The Roman fleet developed stable routes across the English Channel and established ports on both shores, but their experience with the North Sea itself was always limited and marked by respect. Latin texts refer to its waters with adjectives that combine admiration and fear: a sea of mists, of extraordinary tides, of changing depths. The historian Tacitus described in his texts the storms that scattered the Roman fleets off the Scandinavian coasts during the Germanic campaigns, presenting them as phenomena of a violence that Mediterranean soldiers had never experienced. For the peoples who inhabited its coasts for millennia, the North Sea was not simply a geographical feature, it was a living entity, temperamental and profoundly sacred. The Anglo-Saxons called it Garsek, a term of debated etymology that some scholars translate as the spearman, and that evoked the image of an unpredictable warrior. The Norse knew it as a Gyr, not the name of the sea itself, but that of the divinity that inhabited and governed it. In Norse mythology, he was a giant of the sea, different from the gods of the Asgardian pantheon, but linked to them by pacts and celebrations. He was described as a being of enormous power, capable of summoning devastating storms when he so decided, but also as a generous host who held feasts in his submarine palace attended by the gods themselves. His wife Aran was a much more sinister figure. She was represented dragging sailors toward the depths with a net, and it was believed that the drowned were carried to her hall at the bottom of the sea. It was not exactly a hell, but neither was it a paradise. It was simply the domain of Ran, a cold and dark place where the dead of the sea resided forever. The Norse tradition of throwing valuable objects into the sea before a long voyage had a precise logic within this belief system. It was a bribe to Ran so that she would keep her net away. Sailors departing on dangerous journeys made offerings of gold and silver to the waters, not as an act of blind devotion, but as a transaction with a power that could decide their fate. The asymmetry of power was absolute. Humans could negotiate with the sea, but never dominate it. The figure of the Kraken also belongs to this sea. Although the creature appeared in various Scandinavian traditions, it was the North Sea, with its mixture of abyssal depths in the north and shallow banks in the centre, the natural setting that best matched the descriptions of the monster. Bishop Erik Pontoppidan, in his Natural History of Norway published in 1752, offered one of the most detailed descriptions of the Kraken, an animal of such size that its back could be mistaken for an island, capable of producing whirlpools when submerging that dragged entire ships. Pontoppidan did not speak of legends, but of testimonies of sailors whom he considered reliable witnesses. Modern science has found a plausible origin for the Kraken in the giant squid, Architeuthis dux, a deep-sea cephalopod that can reach lengths of up to 15 meters and that inhabits the northern oceans. Sailors who occasionally encountered specimens stranded on the coasts, or who glimpsed them from the surface, had sufficient reasons to imagine that creatures of that type could reach much greater dimensions in the inaccessible depths. The leap from observation to legend is understandable, almost inevitable for people who lived in intimate and frequently mortal contact with the sea. But the mythology of the North Sea was not limited to visible or almost visible beings. The lights of St. Elmo, those plasma discharges that appear on the masts of ships during electrical storms, were interpreted by northern sailors as signs of spirits or supernatural presences. According to tradition, seeing a single light was a bad omen. It meant that a sailor would die during the voyage. 2 lights were a sign of salvation. This binary reading of the phenomenon reflected the dual nature of the sea, always capable both of killing and of forgiving, and always unpredictable in its choice. Ghost ships constitute another persistent category of the marine folklore of the North Sea. The Flying Dutchman is the best known of these legends, a ship condemned to sail the seas forever without being able to dock at any port. Although the legend has versions set at the Cape of Good Hope, its origin lies in the trade routes of the North Sea and the Baltic. The most widespread version places the curse in northern waters. Captain van der Decken, refusing to yield to a storm and blaspheming against God, was condemned together with his crew to sail without rest until the day of the final judgment. Seeing the Flying Dutchman was considered an omen of imminent death for whoever sighted it. The figure of the mermaid in the traditions of Northern Europe differs significantly from the Mediterranean version. While the Greek siren was a seductive being who lured sailors to death with her song, the marine creatures of Norse and Germanic folklore were fundamentally ambiguous presences, capable of helping or destroying with equal ease. The Nixon of Germanic folklore, aquatic beings that inhabited rivers and seas, could reveal the future or drag the unwary toward the bottom. Norwegian sailors who sighted a havfru, a woman of the sea, interpreted the encounter as a sign of an imminent storm. The experience of generations of navigators who saw storms appear without sufficient warning crystallized in that image. The sea itself sent messengers to announce its anger. The less romantic but more disturbing figure of the coastal folklore of the North Sea is that of the wrecker, the inhabitant of the coasts who not only took advantage of shipwrecks, but actively contributed to causing them. Accusations of wrecking, of lighting false lights in dangerous places to lure ships toward reefs or sandbanks, appear in the legal records of coastal communities of Cornwall, of the Frisian Islands, and of the Scottish Hebrides from the Middle Ages well into the 19th century. Whether the practice was as widespread as these records suggest, or whether it was partly a legend projected by successful port communities onto their competitors, is something historians debate. What is undeniable is that the remains of shipwrecks, from the wood of the hulls to the goods in the holds, constituted an economic resource of the first magnitude for the poor communities of the coasts of the North Sea. The sea killed, but it also fed those who waited on the shore. No people embodied the relationship with the North Sea in such an intense and consistent way as the Vikings. Between the 8th and 11th centuries of our era, the Scandinavian peoples built a maritime civilization that transformed northern Europe and, through their expeditions, reached North America, the Mediterranean, Constantinople, and the Russian steppes. All of this was possible thanks to a technical mastery of the North Sea that no contemporary people could equal. The Drakkar, the Viking longship, was a work of naval engineering specifically adapted to the conditions of the North Sea. Its flat keel allowed it to sail in shallow waters and to beach on shores without the need for a port. Its construction in overlapping oak planks, the clinker technique, gave it a structural flexibility that allowed it to absorb the movement of the waves without breaking. It could be propelled both by oar and by sail, which made it independent of the wind, and its reduced draft, combined with its lightness, allowed it to be transported on rollers across dry land to bypass obstacles or access inland rivers. The Vikings navigated the North Sea without modern nautical charts, without a compass, without measuring instruments. They used the sun and the stars, the direction of the wind, the colour and temperature of the water, the behaviour of birds and cetaceans, the currents, and the characteristics of the swell. Some researchers have proposed that they use crystals of Iceland's spar, calcite, as primitive polarimeters capable of detecting the position of the sun even on cloudy days, although the archaeological evidence of this practice is still the subject of debate. The invasion of Lindisfarne in the year 793 is considered the official beginning of the Viking Age. The attack on the monastery of the sacred island of Lindisfarne off the northeast coast of England was not only an act of plunder, but a demonstration of the power that mastery of the North Sea granted to those who could cross it with speed and stealth. The monks who inhabited the island believed they were protected by their marine isolation. The Vikings showed them that the sea was not a barrier but a highway. The Viking trade routes across the North Sea connected the markets of timber, furs, ivory, and slaves of the north with the urban centres of Western Europe. The cities of Hedeby in present-day Denmark, Kaupang in Norway, and Birka in Sweden were nodes of a commercial network that depended entirely on safe navigation through those waters. The North Sea in this period was not only a battlefield, but the infrastructure upon which the economy of Northern Europe was built. Death at sea had for the Vikings a specific religious dimension. To fall in combat or to drown in a storm were honourable forms of death, although tradition distinguished between warriors killed in battle who went to Valhalla and sailors drowned who passed to the realm of Ran. The practice of ship burial, archaeologically documented in numerous Scandinavian sites, reflected the belief that the ship was the necessary vehicle for the journey to the afterlife. The sea, in the Viking worldview, was simultaneously the space of active life, the domain of death and the threshold to the other world. The Hansa, the Hanseatic League, was the commercial successor of the Viking world in the North Sea. Between the 13th and 17th centuries, this alliance of mercantile cities of northern Europe, with Lübeck as the dominant city, controlled the maritime trade of the North Sea and the Baltic with an efficiency that no national state of the time could replicate. The Hanseatic Korger, ships with round bellies and high decks, sailed the same routes as the Viking longships, but loaded with grain, textiles, salt, timber and metals. The prosperity of cities such as Hamburg, Bremen, Bruges, London and Amsterdam depended directly on the ability to keep those maritime routes open against piracy, storms and the competition of rival powers. The North Sea was literally the economic engine of medieval northern Europe. The cartography of the North Sea evolved slowly over the centuries, and each advance in the knowledge of its seabed, its currents, and its meteorological patterns was paid for with shipwrecks. Medieval Portolan charts, those coastal navigation maps drawn from the accumulated experience of generations of sailors, captured the coastlines and the main ports with notable precision, but they were incapable of adequately representing the shifting sandbanks that dotted the southern coastline of the North Sea. The sandbank of Goodwin Sands off the coast of Kent in England is known as the Great Ship Swallower. Over the centuries it is estimated that more than 2,000 ships have wrecked in its shallow and treacherous waters, trapped by sands that move with every storm and that can bury a hull within a matter of hours. The Dutch coast with its labyrinthine channels between sand islands was equally feared. To sail at night or in fog in those waters without a local pilot was to wager one's life. The North Sea generates the most violent winds of Western Europe. Its geographical position makes it a perfect trap. For Atlantic storms, low-pressure systems that form in the North Atlantic travel eastward, driven by the jet stream at altitude, and when they reach the North Sea, they encounter a relatively confined body of water over which they can develop all their energy. Northwesterly winds, the most frequent and dangerous, blow unobstructed over hundreds of kilometers of open water before reaching the eastern coasts, where they generate the most devastating floods in European history. Fetch, the nautical term that describes the distance over which the wind can act on the surface of the water to generate waves, is one of the determining factors of the danger of a sea. In the North Atlantic, the fetch is practically unlimited. The wind can blow for days over thousands of kilometers of ocean, generating long-period waves with enormous wavelengths that carry colossal energy. When these ocean waves enter the North Sea through the strait between Norway and the Shetland Islands, they encounter progressively shallower waters that compress and deform their structure. Giant waves, or rogue waves, are a phenomenon that the North Sea produces with an unusually high frequency. For decades, the existence of waves of 20, 25, or even 30 meters in height was considered by academic oceanography to be an exaggeration by sailors. The mathematical models of the time maintained that waves of that magnitude should be statistically impossible or, at least, extremely rare. On January 1, 1995, the Draupner oil platform, located in the Norwegian North Sea, recorded through instrumented sensors a wave of 25.6 meters in height under general sea conditions of 12 meters. It was the first objective scientific confirmation of the existence of giant waves. The mechanism of formation of giant waves is linked to the nonlinear interaction between different wave trains. When several series of waves with similar but not identical wavelengths overlap, constructive interference can momentarily occur that concentrates their energy at a single point. In the North Sea, where Atlantic waves mix with local swell generated by regional storms and with disturbances produced by irregular seabeds and strong currents. The conditions for this interaction are frequent. The tides of the North Sea present their own characteristics that add an additional layer of complexity and danger. The sea behaves like a partially enclosed bathtub. Atlantic tides enter from the north and from the English Channel, and the interaction between these two tidal signals generates a complex pattern, with zones where the amplitude of the tide is practically null, surrounded by regions where the tides are extremely pronounced. In the Severn estuary, in Great Britain, tides reach 15 metres in amplitude. In the Wadden Sea, the coastal zone of the Netherlands and Germany, the tides create and destroy extensive intertidal zones twice a day, shaping a landscape in perpetual motion. Tidal currents in narrow zones such as the English Channel and the Dover Strait can reach speeds of several knots, sufficient to significantly divert the trajectory of a ship or to create dangerous whirlpools in shallow areas. Medieval navigators knew these currents empirically and incorporated them into their usual routes. But for an inexperienced sailor or for a damaged ship, an opposing tidal current could be as lethal as the most violent storm. The phenomenon of surge, the elevation of sea level produced by the accumulation of water pushed by the wind against a coast of low relief, is particularly devastating in the southern North Sea. When a long-lasting northern wind pushes the water southward, accumulating it in the funnel formed by the coasts of the Netherlands, Belgium, and the eastern part of England, the result can be a rise in sea level that adds to the astronomical tide, and that can exceed several meters. This effect, multiplied by a coastal topography that offers little natural resistance to the advance of water, is the mechanism responsible for the worst floods in the history of the southern North Sea. Modern surge prediction models have drastically reduced warning time, but the physics of the process has not changed. Fog is another historical enemy of the navigator in the North Sea. The cold waters that flow from the north collide in the southern limit of the sea with the warmer air coming from the European continent, generating banks of dense fog with a frequency that makes the North Sea one of the seas with the lowest average visibility in the Northern Hemisphere. Before radar and satellite positioning systems, navigating in dense fog in the North Sea was an exercise in deduction and luck in equal parts. The lighthouses that line its coasts, built from the 17th century onward with increasing density, represent the accumulated attempt of entire civilizations to impose order on that darkness. Some of the most iconic lighthouses in the world are in the North Sea, that of Eddystone, off Plymouth, whose first tower was swept away by the storm of 1703, before its builders learned how to make it resistant. That of Bell Rock on the Scottish coast, built between 1807 and 1811 on a rock that is exposed only at low tide and that had destroyed more than 70 ships in 3 decades. Each lighthouse in the North Sea tells a story of shipwrecks that preceded it. The seabed of the North Sea is one of the densest ship graveyards in the world. It is estimated that more than 30,000 vessels have wrecked in its waters throughout the documented centuries, from the Roman galleys that crossed the English Channel to the destroyers of the Second World War. Each historical period has left its layer of rusted iron and rotting wood on the sandy seabed. The shipwreck of the Spanish Armada in 1588 is one of the most well-known naval disasters in European history, although its relationship with the North Sea is usually underestimated. After the failure of the attempt to invade England, the Spanish fleet tried to return to its bases by sailing around the British Isles to the north, tracing a route that carried it through the waters of the North Sea and later along the western coasts of Scotland and Ireland. The storms that awaited it on that route were relentless. More than 20 ships were wrecked off the Irish and Scottish coasts in the months of September and October of 1588, with human losses that some historians estimate at more than 5,000 men. The North Sea did not attack the Armada directly, but it was the alternative route imposed by its geography that destroyed it. The Great Storm of 1703 remains the most destructive storm recorded in the history of Great Britain. Between November the 24th and 28th, a low-pressure system of extraordinary intensity swept across the North Sea with winds that modern meteorologists estimate between 120 and 150 kilometers per hour. Between 4,000 and 8,000 vessels sank, between 8,000 and 15,000 people perished, and 12 warships of the Royal Navy disappeared in the storm with the entirety of their crews. Daniel Defoe, who documented the disaster in his work, The Storm, published the following year, described scenes of devastation that covered the entire southern coast of England. Ships stranded on solid land, several kilometers from the coast, church bells dragged by the wind, roofs flying over entire cities. The case of HMS Royal George, sunk in 1782, not in the North Sea but in the Solent, off Portsmouth, illustrates how even in waters considered safe, a ship could disappear in minutes. However, it is within the North Sea itself that the Second World War left an extraordinary number of sinkings that still affect present-day navigation. The minefields sown by both sides during the conflict were not completely neutralized after the armistice. It is estimated that between 600,000 and 1 million naval mines were placed in the North Sea during both World Wars, and that even today dozens of them are discovered and accidentally detonated each year during dredging operations and the construction of offshore infrastructure. The sinking of the Princess Victoria in January 1953 illustrates the capacity of the North Sea to destroy even modern passenger vessels under adverse conditions. The 2,694-ton ferry departed from Stranraer in Scotland toward Larne in Northern Ireland on the morning of January 31st in deteriorating weather conditions. A series of errors of judgment, combined with a storm that reached force 12 on the Beaufort scale, resulted in the sinking of the ship with 133 of its 177 passengers and crew members. The catastrophe occurred only a few miles from the coast, in waters considered relatively familiar for the route. The proximity of land offered no protection. In the conditions of the North Sea during a full winter storm, a few miles could be as insurmountable as the open ocean. The sinking of the MV Derbyshire in 1980 opened a scientific debate about the vulnerability of large modern ships to rogue waves. The Derbyshire was the largest British cargo ship of its time, almost 300 meters in length, 169,000 tons of deadweight. It disappeared in the Pacific during Typhoon Orchid without leaving survivors or a distress signal. Although its sinking occurred far from the North Sea, the subsequent investigation, which included the first underwater exploration of the wreck at 4,200 meters of depth, revealed damage consistent with the impact of a wave of extraordinary dimensions. The Derbyshire case was one of the pieces of evidence that pushed oceanography to take seriously the existence of rogue waves, a phenomenon that the North Sea had been producing without anyone documenting it scientifically. Among the most unsettling shipwrecks of the North Sea due to their unexplained circumstances is that of the MV Orang Medan, a cargo ship whose story sails on the boundary between verifiable historical document and naval legend. According to the records of the time, in the late 1940s, several ships received a desperate distress signal from a freighter that identified its name and reported that all its crew members were dead or dying. When the rescue ships arrived, they found the Orang Medan with its entire crew dead, the bodies with expressions of horror, and no visible sign of violence or structural damage. The ship sank before it could be towed. No official record has been able to verify the existence of the vessel or confirm the incident, which keeps it in that uncomfortable territory between genuine mystery and fabricated story, a space that the North Sea, with its historical opacity and inaccessible depths, generates with unusual frequency. On the night of July 6, 1988, an explosion destroyed the Piper Alpha oil platform in the North Sea, 193 kilometres off the Scottish coast. In the following 2 hours, a series of secondary explosions of increasing intensity turned the installation into a torch of fire that could be seen from the coast. 167 of the 226 workers present on the platform died. It was the worst accident in the history of the offshore oil industry and one of the most lethal industrial disasters of the 20th century. Piper Alpha was in 1988 one of the most productive platforms in the North Sea. Originally built for the extraction of crude oil, it had been adapted to also handle natural gas, a modification that added complexity to its piping systems without an adequate update of the safety protocols. The platform produced approximately 10% of the North Sea's oil at the time of the accident and was the central node of a system of pipelines that connected it with other platforms and with the coast. The chain of events that led to the disaster began with a routine maintenance procedure during the day of July 6th. A gas condensate pump was taken out of service for inspection, and the corresponding work permit was completed and filed. However, during the night, when another team of workers needed to start that backup pump because the main pump had failed, the maintenance permit indicating that the first was not operational was not consulted or was not found. The pump was activated with a blind plug instead of the safety valve that had been removed for inspection. The result was a leak of highly flammable gas condensate that ignited with the first available ignition source. The first explosion was serious but not necessarily fatal for the platform. What turned the accident into a catastrophe was the breakdown of the emergency response protocols among the interconnected platforms. The pipeline system that connected Piper Alpha with the neighbouring platforms, Tartan and Claymore continued pumping gas and hydrocarbons toward the burning platform for a critical period, because the personnel responsible for the neighbouring platforms did not receive the shutdown order, or hesitated to give it without explicit authorization, or simply did not understand the seriousness of the situation. When the high-pressure pipelines coming from Tartan yielded to the heat of the fire, the resulting explosion was of a magnitude that no firefighting effort could have contained. The survivors described a scenario of absolute chaos, aggravated by the absence of leadership and clear instructions. The platform's communication system was destroyed in the first minutes. Many workers took refuge in the control room, which became a deadly trap when the explosions reached that part of the installation. Others waited at different points on the platform for a rescue that did not arrive in time. Some jumped from heights of 15 to 30 meters into the burning sea, a desperate decision that, despite the enormous risk, was the one that saved the lives of several survivors. Nearby support vessels attempted to approach to rescue those who had jumped into the water, but the heat and the risk of explosion severely limited their capabilities. The work of the rescue vessel Sandhaven and its captain, Ian Letty, is one of the most extraordinary episodes of the night. Letty manoeuvred his vessel to the minimum possible distance from the burning platform to collect survivors from the water, making real-time decisions about how close he could approach without his own ship being destroyed by the explosions. His actions and those of other sailors from the support vessels were recognized as decisive in saving the 61 lives that were able to be rescued. The subsequent investigation, led by Lord Cullen and published in 1990, was devastating in its analysis of responsibilities. Cullen found that the catastrophe had been the cumulative result of failures in the work permit system, in the training of emergency personnel, in the design of the response systems of the interconnected pipelines, and, fundamentally, in the safety culture of the operating company Occidental Petroleum. The recommendations of the Cullen Report radically transformed the regulation of the offshore industry in the North Sea. It was established that each installation had to prepare a case for safety, an exhaustive document that demonstrated the understanding of all present risks and the measures taken to mitigate them, and that this document had to be independently verified. The regulatory legacy of Piper Alpha was so significant that some specialists consider it the equivalent in the offshore industry of what the 3 Mile Island accident represented for nuclear power, an event that redefined safety standards worldwide. However, the Piper Alpha platform also left a wound in the human geography of northeastern Scotland that took decades to close. Aberdeen, the city that served as the logistical base for North Sea operations, and where many of the deceased workers lived, faced a collective mourning of unusual intensity. In small communities in northeastern Scotland, almost every family knew someone who had died on the platform. The Piper Alpha Memorial, located in the Winter Garden of Aberdeen, bears engraved the names of the 167 deceased. It is, in scale, one of the monuments to industrial victims most laden with history in Europe. In September 1959, an exploratory drilling operation in the Netherlands discovered the Groningen natural gas field, one of the largest in the world. The discovery transformed the geological perception of the North Sea subsoil. If hydrocarbon accumulations of that magnitude existed under Dutch land, it was reasonable to suppose that the seabed could contain similar or larger deposits. Offshore exploration began almost immediately, and in 1965 the first exploratory well was drilled in British waters of the North Sea. The discovery of the Ekofisk oil field by the company Phillips Petroleum in December 1969 in the Norwegian sector of the North Sea confirmed that the seabed contained hydrocarbon reserves of the highest global order. Ekofisk proved to be one of the largest oil fields in Europe, with reserves initially estimated at around 3 billion barrels. In the following years, discoveries multiplied. Forties in the British sector in 1970, Brent also in the British sector in 1971, Statfjord in the Norwegian sector in 1974. In less than a decade, the North Sea had gone from being considered mainly a fishing zone to becoming one of the most important oil regions in the world. The exploitation of these resources in the extreme conditions of the North Sea required the development of completely new technologies. Production platforms had to withstand waves of 20 meters and winds of more than 150 kilometers per hour, operate in sub-zero temperatures, and maintain their position with millimetric precision over production wells hundreds of meters deep. The engineers who designed the first North Sea platforms did not have previous experience in comparable climatic conditions. The offshore industry had been born in the Gulf of Mexico, where conditions are much less demanding. The accident of the Alexander Key Land platform in March 1980 was the second major tragedy of the offshore industry in the North Sea and the greatest disaster in the history of the Norwegian industry. Alexander Key Land was not a production platform but a floating accommodation installation for workers, a pentapod with 5 columns that served as housing for the personnel of the Ekofisk field. A structural fatigue in one of the columns caused the rupture of a support, and the platform capsized in less than 20 minutes in rough sea conditions. 123 of the 212 people on board died. The investigation revealed that the accident had been caused by a welding defect in a structural connection that was never detected by routine inspections. The abundance of oil and natural gas in the North Sea had geopolitical consequences of the highest order. For the United Kingdom, the discovery of its offshore reserves coincided with a period of severe economic difficulties in the early 1970s, and oil revenues contributed significantly to the stabilisation of the British economy during the following decade. For Norway, the management of its North Sea petroleum resources became a model of natural wealth administration. The Norwegian Government Pension Fund, popularly known as the Oil Fund, created in 1990 to manage petroleum surpluses, has become the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, with assets exceeding €1.5 trillion. Hydrocarbon production in the North Sea has been gradually declining since it reached its peak in the late 1990s. The largest fields are in the depletion phase, and the industry has had to resort to increasingly costly, enhanced recovery technologies to maintain production flows. The debate about the energy future of the North Sea has acquired new dimensions with the development of offshore wind energy. The sea that for half a century was synonymous with oil is now becoming the largest offshore wind energy laboratory in the world. The constant and powerful winds that for centuries constituted the main threat to navigators have become the energy resource that can define the next century of the basin. The Bravo spill, which occurred in the Ekofisk field in April 1977, was the largest accidental oil spill in the history of the North Sea up to that moment. A failure during well workover operations allowed oil to flow uncontrolled for 8 days, releasing approximately 22,000 tons of crude oil into the sea. The incident was finally controlled thanks to the intervention of well control expert Red Adair, who travelled from Texas with his team. The Bravo spill demonstrated that the North Sea offshore industry did not possess sufficient in-house means to face large-scale emergencies, a deficiency that prompted the creation of the first regional hydrocarbon spill response systems in European waters. No other sea has been the scene of so many decisive naval battles in such a short span of time as the North Sea during the 19th and 20th centuries. Its position as a strategic corridor between the Atlantic and the interior European seas turned it into a permanent arena of dispute among naval powers, seeking control of the commercial and military routes of northern Europe. The Battle of Jutland, fought between May 31st and June 1st, 1916, was the largest naval confrontation of the First World War, and one of the largest in all of history. The British Grand Fleet, under Admiral Jellicoe, and the German High Seas Fleet, commanded by Admiral Scheer, confronted each other for hours in the waters of the North Sea off the coast of Jutland, the Danish peninsula. More than 250 warships and 100,000 men took part. The losses were enormous on both sides. The Royal Navy lost 14 ships and more than 6,000 men. The Kaiserliche Marine lost 11 ships and more than 2,500 men. The tactical result was ambiguous. The German fleet inflicted greater losses on the British, but failed to break the naval blockade that strangled the supply of raw materials to Germany. Jellicoe, Churchill observed, was the only man on both sides who could lose the war in an afternoon. The Second World War turned the North Sea into a multidimensional battlefield that included surface naval combat, submarine warfare, aerial attacks, mining operations and mine countermeasures, infiltrations and evacuations of secret agents, and the transport of millions of tons of supplies essential to the Allied war effort. The Battle of the Atlantic, although usually associated with the open ocean, had one of its principal theatres in the North Sea. German submarines systematically attacked the convoys that transported supplies from North America to British ports, and a significant proportion of these attacks occurred in the relatively shallow waters of the North Sea. The evacuation of Dunkirk in May and June 1940 is probably the most well-known episode of the war in the North Sea. More than 330,000 Allied soldiers, mainly British and French, were evacuated from the beaches of the French city under fire from German aviation by means of an improvised flotilla of hundreds of civilian and military vessels. The conditions of the North Sea in those days of late May and early June were unusually favourable, with little swell and good visibility, a circumstance that survivors and historians have pointed out as a determining factor in the success of the operation. The North Sea, which had so often shown itself to be implacable, offered at that precise moment a pause in its habitual hostility. Naval mining operations in the North Sea during both World Wars seeded its waters with an extraordinary number of explosive devices. Germany established defensive minefields along its coasts and on the routes that the Allies used for supply. The Allies laid offensive mines to block the exits of German ports and the passages of submarines. By the end of the First World War, more than 200,000 mines had been laid in the North Sea. By the end of the Second, the total accumulated figure was probably greater than 1 million. The clearance of these devices was a task that consumed decades, and that has still not concluded. Accidental explosions of old mines during construction work on submarine infrastructure are a phenomenon that occurs regularly. Privateering warfare in the North Sea has a history that precedes, by far, the world conflicts of the 20th century. During the Napoleonic Wars, privateers and flotillas of small ships used their intimate knowledge of the coasts and shoals of the North Sea to harass British maritime trade with an effectiveness that no conventional war fleet could replicate. Coastal warfare, the attack on merchant convoys from ports difficult for enemy ships of the line to access, turned the North Sea into a theatre of irregular warfare that, in many respects, anticipated the submarine warfare of the 20th century. Knowledge of the maritime terrain, the ability to navigate in conditions of reduced visibility, and to use the shoals and narrow channels as refuge, were tactical advantages that larger and better armed vessels could not easily neutralize. The campaign of German submarines in the North Sea during the First World War introduced a completely new dimension in naval warfare. The U-boats could operate in the relatively shallow waters of the North Sea, with greater limitations than in the open ocean, but the psychological and strategic effect of their presence was enormous. The sinking of the RMS Lusitania in 1915, although it occurred in the Atlantic, was the direct result of the German policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, whose principal theatre was the North Sea and the waters surrounding the British Isles. The Allied response included the laying of the Northern Barrage, or the Great North Sea Barrage, a minefield that extended from Scotland to Norway, with the objective of closing the passage to German submarines. It never functioned completely as a barrier, but the quantity of mines it consumed, more than 70,000, illustrates the scale of resources that the powers in conflict were willing to invest to control those waters. The North Sea has flooded the lands that surround it repeatedly throughout history, with consequences that in some cases permanently altered the geography and the demography of entire regions. The low coasts of the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, and eastern England have spent thousands of years in a constant struggle against the advance of the sea, a struggle that has shaped hydraulic engineering, social organization, and the cultural identity of these peoples in a way that has no parallel in any other region of Europe. the All Saints' Flood of 1170, and the successive medieval floods that affected the Netherlands permanently transformed the geography of the region. The sea penetrated inland through the mouths of rivers and through the estuaries, widening and deepening them until creating new inland seas. The Zuiderzee, the great inland gulf that occupied the centre of the Netherlands until its partial closure in the 20th century, was created directly by the medieval floods that broke the natural peat barriers that separated the inland lakes from the sea. It is estimated that the medieval Dutch floods killed tens of thousands of people and destroyed hundreds of villages that were never rebuilt. The Great Flood of 1953 is the deadliest natural disaster of the 20th century in Western Europe, on the night of January 31st to February 1st, a combination of an exceptional storm, high tide, and a force 12 north wind generated a storm surge of up to 5.5 meters above the normal level at some points along the Dutch and English coasts. The dikes that protected the lands reclaimed from the sea in the Netherlands were overtopped or broken at more than 100 points. The water flooded more than 150,000 hectares of land. 1,836 people died in the Netherlands, 307 in the United Kingdom, and dozens more in Belgium. 100,000 people were evacuated from their homes. The response to the catastrophe of 1953 gave rise to one of the most ambitious hydraulic engineering projects in human history, the Dutch Delta Plan. The project, approved in 1958 and completed in its principal elements in 1997, consisted of the closure or reinforcement of the estuaries and sea arms that crossed the province of Zeeland and the islands of the southern Netherlands through a series of dams and movable barriers of extraordinary dimensions. The central piece of the system, the Maesland barrier, completed in 1997, consists of two articulated steel gates more than 200 meters long each that close automatically when the sea level in Rotterdam threatens to exceed 3 meters above the normal level. Climate change adds a new dimension of urgency to the challenges that the North Sea poses to the bordering countries. The mean sea level in the North Sea rose by approximately 20 centimeters in the 20th century, and projections for the 21st century point to increases that could exceed 1 meter under the highest emission scenarios. For the Netherlands, where approximately 26% of the territory lies below sea level and 60% would be vulnerable to flooding without the existing protection systems, every centimetre of sea level rise represents an increase in the cost and complexity of maintaining coastal protection. North Sea storms are also changing. Instrumental data and climate models suggest that, although the total number of storms may not increase significantly, the most intense storms will be more frequent and their trajectory will shift northward, affecting the most exposed coasts more directly. The Sava storm of December 2013 produced in the North Sea the highest surges recorded since 1953, although modern early warning systems and improvements in coastal protection allowed populations at risk to be evacuated in time, avoiding a catastrophe comparable to that of that year. The difference between 1953 and 2013 was not the intensity of the storms, but the ability to predict them and respond to them. The history of the Dutch polders, those stretches of land reclaimed from the sea through dikes and drainage pumps, summarizes more eloquently than any other example the relationship between the peoples of the North Sea and its waters. The Netherlands has reclaimed from the sea more than 7,000 square kilometers of territory over the centuries, literally creating the ground on which part of its national territory rests. Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, cities that exist because generations of engineers, farmers and politicians decided that it was possible to win land from the most dangerous sea in Europe and did it. The relationship is neither one of submission nor of domination, but of permanent negotiation, with a force that never ceases to remind of its ability to reclaim what it yields. The North Sea still holds mysteries that even the most advanced technology has not been able to resolve completely. The seabed, crossed by submarine canyons, strewn with wrecks, dotted with craters produced by gas explosions and marked by the scars of ancient glaciers, is an archive of the region's history, studied with a mixture of archaeological, geological and oceanographic tools. The case of U-1206 belongs to that category of stories that the North Sea produces with a certain regularity, events that combine the tragic with the improbable. In April 1945, the German submarine U-1206, equipped with the new high-pressure toilet system designed to operate at greater depths than previous models, was on patrol beneath the North Sea off the Scottish coast. An officer made a mistake in operating the complicated mechanism of the toilet. Seawater entered massively into the hull. The gases from the battery accumulator that were released upon contact with seawater forced the crew to surface. On the surface, they were attacked by British aircraft. The U-1206 was sunk, 4 crew members died, and the rest were captured. The war, which Germany would lose weeks later, had come to an end for that submarine in a way that no manual of naval tactics had foreseen. The wrecks of the Second World War that rest on the bottom of the North Sea pose an environmental problem of increasing urgency. Many of these ships, both military and civilian, carried fuel in their tanks when they were sunk. Decades of saline corrosion are reaching the point at which the hulls may begin to give way, releasing the oil trapped in their tanks. It is estimated that in European waters alone, there are several thousand ships sunk during the Second World War that together contain quantities of hydrocarbons potentially greater than several Exxon Valdez spills. Managing this latent environmental risk is one of the little-known challenges that the countries bordering the North Sea will face in the coming decades. Fishing in the North Sea has undergone a dramatic transformation over the last 2 centuries as a consequence of the industrialization of the fishing industry. Doggerland, which for centuries was one of the most productive fishing grounds in Europe, has experienced a collapse in its populations of cod and other demersal species that marine biologists consider one of the clearest examples of overfishing in history. Cod catches on Doggerland at the beginning of the 20th century were tens of thousands of tons per year. By the end of the 20th century, the populations had fallen to less than 10% of their historical levels. Fisheries management measures implemented in recent decades have allowed a partial recovery, but historical levels are still far from being reached. The cetaceans that inhabit the North Sea and its adjacent waters offer a different perspective on the state of the marine ecosystem. The blue whale, which in historical times was relatively frequent in the waters of the North Atlantic, has practically disappeared from the region as a consequence of commercial hunting in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The harbour porpoise, the smallest cetacean of the North Sea, has experienced significant fluctuations in its population throughout the 20th century, with periods of worrying decline followed by partial recoveries. The noise generated by the offshore industry, by maritime traffic and by the construction of offshore wind farms is one of the factors that researchers study as a potential disturbance to the communication and behaviour of cetaceans in the North Sea. Maritime traffic in the North Sea in the 21st century is one of the densest in the world. More than 200,000 ships cross its waters every year, transporting practically every imaginable category of goods between the ports of Northern Europe and the rest of the world. Rotterdam, the largest port in Europe, handles more than 400 million tons of cargo per year. The Strait of Dover, through which ships entering and leaving the North Sea to the South pass, is considered the busiest maritime corridor on the planet. More than 500 merchant vessels cross it every day, sometimes with lateral separations of barely a few hundred meters. In that context, collision accidents are statistically inevitable over any sufficiently long period. The Coast Guards and maritime traffic services that coordinate movements in these waters use radar surveillance and automatic ship identification systems that would have seemed like science fiction to any sailor of the 19th century. And yet, the North Sea continues to generate accidents, groundings, and emergency situations with a frequency that reminds that the density of traffic and technological sophistication do not eliminate risks but redistribute them. The North Sea of the coming decades will also be the stage for an unprecedented energy transformation. The thousands of wind turbines that already rise above its waters and the tens of thousands projected to be built before 2050 are changing the relationship between the bordering countries and the sea in a way that has historical precedents but also completely new dimensions. The fishing villages of the Dutch, British and Danish coasts that for generations lived in a direct and frequently dangerous relationship with the sea are seeing how that same sea is becoming the source of electrical energy that powers their cities. The geography of the winds that the Vikings learned to read in order to navigate is now the resource that engineers and energy planners calculate in gigawatts and hours of production. Doggerland, the lost continent beneath the waters of the North Sea, remains the most powerful image of the relationship between that sea and the human beings who have bordered it, crossed it, and exploited it for millennia. Its Mesolithic peoples left tools, bones, traces of their fires in the sediment that today is the seabed. The North Sea swallowed them without possible negotiation, without sufficient warning, simply following the implacable logic of glacial melting and of the tsunamis that reshape coasts in a matter of hours. That same process continues on timescales that range from the immediacy of a winter storm to the geological slowness of climate change. The sea that was born from ice continues, 12,000 years later, to be an agent of radical transformation of the world that surrounds it, indifferent to the civilizations that have been built on its shores and that have depended on it, feared it, exploited it, and finally tried to tame it. Researchers who study the bottom of the North Sea with side-scan sonar and sediment dredgers are slowly reconstructing the geography of Doggerland, its rivers, its hills, its estuaries, the places where settlements probably existed. It is an archaeology of the invisible, of a world that disappeared so completely that only scattered fragments remain in the sediment. But those fragments are enough to confirm that the North Sea was not always a sea, that its depths preserved the memory of an inhabited landscape, and that the relationship between its waters and human beings began long before the first Vikings and the first lighthouses and the first oil platforms. It began when it was not yet a sea but a plain through which rivers flowed and mammoths walked, and it was abruptly interrupted when the water claimed that territory forever. Everything that came afterward, the fleets and the shipwrecks, the gods and the monsters, the wars and the storm surges, is the story of what happens when human beings decide to settle and prosper on the shore of something that has no intention of remaining still.